All right, so today we're talking about the second half of James Madison's life. Well, it's more the last third, but last week we talked about his early life. We talked about him being a small, fragile kid, very bright, spending extra years at college just to study more. We talked about his political career and how he was in the House of Representatives before working on the Constitution and really becoming known as the father of the Constitution for proposing the idea that we should have three branches of government and two houses in our Congress. And then after that, working for all three of the presidents who preceded him, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And now we finally come to James Madison as the president. James Madison, our fourth president. So we're going to talk about some of the major events of his presidency and how he handled them. There are three basic things that we'll cover today. And the first one is the largest one, and that's the War of 1812. This is the single most important event of James Madison's presidency, and it's not a war that many people know about, and so it's important for you guys to understand the War of 1812 because it was really the war that allowed and opened up the doors for the United States to move west. There was still a lot of conflict on the frontier that prevented American settlers from moving west, and this War of 1812 settled finally and created basically a doorway to the west to eventually reach California, where we are now. So let's review some of the things that happened before the War of 1812 that ultimately led up to it. So Great Britain and France were at war for a long time. The dictator, or I don't know what you'd call him, Napoleon, the man that ran France, had wanted to basically take over Europe. He had invaded other countries. He was very aggressive, and Great Britain had been at war with him for a long time, trying to prevent him from taking over Europe. And this war had lasted all the way from when he took power right at the beginning of the 18th century to all the way to the War of 1812. And so it was a long war, and it was a difficult war. After the American Revolution, the United States wanted to start trading with people so they could start making money. The problem is if you trade with both Great Britain and France, you're basically giving, it's not really you taking a side, and you're giving both countries resources that they can use to make weapons or ships or buy more weapons or ships. And so the United States wanted to stay neutral. And neutral means that they didn't want to take a side in the war. But both France and the British wanted them to stop helping their enemy. They wanted them to stop trading with the other guy and just trade exclusively with them. But if the United States did that, then ultimately they would lose money. So the United States wanted to trade with both. But both France and Britain decided that they didn't want that to happen. They would prefer that neither country would get help. And so what they would do is they began to attack American ships. And the attacks would happen on their way to trading something with another country. They would board the ships, and they would take the soldiers and the goods, and occasionally just sink the ships. And the big word here is impressment, and this is a review word from our Jefferson presidency. And impressment means to take a sailor. Let's imagine you're a merchant, someone who sells things to other countries on a ship, and then the British capture your ship, and then they take you, and then they impress you. It doesn't mean that they're trying to make you impressed with them, like, oh, they're so cool. It means to take you, capture you, and then make you join one of the warships of Great Britain. So one day you're a merchant selling, let's say, tobacco to Great Britain, and the next day you're on a British warship headed to war with France. And so suddenly you could be picked up and taken and become part of another country's army. So Jefferson, the president before Madison, didn't like this, so he decided to just end all trade with other countries, specifically Britain and France. He thought the solution to prevent people from being impressed and putting into another army was just to stop all trade entirely. Again, this is a review because last time we explained that this was very unpopular because what it did was it stopped the flow of money. There wasn't people to trade with because he had stopped it, and so as a result, Americans were the ones who were ultimately hurt the most because they lost their trading partners. And so eventually this embargo was lifted, but then immediately after, France and Great Britain resumed doing exactly what they had done before of attacking the ships and impressing the sailors on them. So in addition to attacking merchant ships, the British were also working with Native Americans, specifically in the northwest of the United States, which at that time wasn't that far west. And so what they were doing was they were, through their partners in Canada, because remember Canada's still a part of Great Britain at this point. I mean, it still is today. It's considered a commonwealth, meaning that it's part of the British Empire in some ways. The British began sending weapons and resources to Native Americans, and then Native Americans would in turn use these weapons and resources to fight the settlers that were pushing into their land. And so essentially, what the British were doing was they were attacking the U.S. on both sides. They were attacking the U.S. in the ocean by preventing them from trading, and they were also attacking them in the West as they were pushing further into the United States territory. And so Native Americans would regularly attack American settlers and soldiers, and then they would return to safety in Canada. And so this was the second reason why that ultimately would lead to the War of 1812 is the United States was being attacked on both fronts. So in 1812, in June of 1812, Madison declares war with Britain. There were a group of people called the War Hawks who were pushing for this to happen. And then there were also a group of people that thought it was way too aggressive. Typically, whenever a country goes to war, there's people who want to go to war, and they're called hawks. So imagine like a bird of prey, a hawk, like very aggressive bird. And then there are the people that don't want to go to war. And the word for them typically is a dove. And if you think of a dove, it's a beautiful, docile bird that doesn't really attack. And so the doves and the hawks are the two ways that people describe whether they want to go to war or don't want to go to war. Now, the people that didn't want to go to war, one of the reasons that they didn't want to go is the United States didn't have a strong army or navy. So Thomas Jefferson, the president before Madison, began to dismantle a lot of the armies that had built up from the American Revolution because they were so expensive to maintain. You had to pay all of these soldiers. And Jefferson didn't like big government, and so he began to dismantle these war departments. And this is a problem if you're going to war because you need an army, you need a navy. And the British were famous for having the strongest navy in the world. And at this point, the American Navy was tiny and could not match the British Navy in terms of strength. So a couple battles in the war that you should know about. The Battle of Put-in Bay, and so I'm going to jump to this map here. So the Battle of Put-in Bay, I'm going to bring my cursor over here, took place on Lake Erie. This is Lake Erie. These are the Great Lakes that are in the northeast of the United States. And Lake Erie, you can see, runs along from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Now the British with the help of the Canadians, had controlled Detroit right here, which was an important city um, in connecting Canada to the United States. And so the Battle of Lake Erie was basically the battle for who would control all of these countries that bordered along the lakes here, because they could come down through the St. Lawrence River and control a lot of this territory. So ultimately, it was a naval battle. The United States lost 9 ships in the battle, but they were able to capture 6 British ships and ultimately win, which this battle was very important because this battle allowed the United States to ultimately control these territories that at one point were considered part of Canada but are considered part of the United States. And so this battle was very important in terms of the United States maintaining all of this territory here along the Northwest. There might not be a Detroit today without the Battle of Put-in-Bay. The Battle of the Thames, or Thames, the Battle of the Thames was a battle with the Native American leader Tecumseh. He had harassed the the Americans for a long time. There were many battles before the War of 1812 with him, and this battle was ultimately the battle that pushed this Native American group out of the way of westward expansion, pushed them further into Canada. And so this battle was important in terms of moving a Native American tribe out of the way of American expansion. And then the final battle is the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So the Battle of Horseshoe Bend was led by Andrew Jackson, who's going to be one of the presidents we'll talk about in probably a month or so. And Andrew Jackson defeated the Creek Empire, and the Creeks were a group of Native Americans that controlled a lot of land here in Alabama and Georgia. And so ultimately the victory of the battle, of this battle, ultimately led to the control of all of this land here, and ended the Creek War, ended the war with the Native Americans. And as we get closer to Andrew Jackson's presidency, we'll see that Andrew Jackson ultimately will take the remainder of these Creek people out of here, out of this area that they still were living on, and push them further west so the United States could control all of Alabama and Georgia. Now, one of the famous things that happened in the War of 1812 was the White House burned down. In 1814, right before the end of the war, the British invaded Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is right along a major river, and it's part of a peninsula. And so the British could take their ships right up to the edge of D.C. Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, did not want to leave at first. She didn't leave until she actually saw the British ships approaching the harbor. After she changed her mind, she was able to get out some very important documents. And she was also able to get out the famous portrait of George Washington that was done while he was president. The British ultimately invaded and burned down the White House and many other federal buildings. They essentially destroyed Washington, D.C., and it would have to later be rebuilt. And so the White House that we have today, even though it's been refurbished, would come much later. The original White House was different and was destroyed ultimately. The final battle of the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans. New Orleans is probably the most famous battle, in part because Andrew Jackson led it. And the Battle of New Orleans is also famous because of how amazing of a victory it was. So Andrew Jackson basically assembled an army. I chose the word on the slide, motley crew, which basically means a group of different kinds of people. They weren't all soldiers. So you had, you can look in this picture over here, you see fur trappers, these guys with the raccoon caps. You got regular soldiers. There were Native Americans who fought. So it was a bunch of random people put together to try and defend the city of New Orleans. the British approached New Orleans with ships with 8,000 soldiers and were planning to invade and take over control of the Mississippi River that ran through New Orleans, which was a major river in the United States. Ultimately, Jackson won the conflict, and they weren't able to invade and land and go into New Orleans, and he only lost 100 men. The British would end up losing 2,000 soldiers in this conflict. So Andrew Jackson was able to achieve this magnificent victory, which he would use it as one of his qualifications to run for president, that he was such a good general and soldier. Ultimately, Britain and the U.S. signed a peace treaty in 1814. And it's interesting that the Battle of New Orleans actually took place after peace was declared, because the word that a treaty had been signed didn't reach the U.S. in time to stop the battle. Because if you remember, there were no telephones, there was no internet. Messages traveled by ship, and it could take weeks, if not months, to get across. And so ultimately, the word didn't reach in time, and so there was a battle that took place after the countries were already at peace with each other. So after the war, the United States began to rebuild Washington, D.C. It took some time. It took 3 years, actually, to rebuild the White House. And James Monroe would be the next president who would live in it. Ultimately, James Madison might have spent some time there, but it was very small because his presidency... No, actually, he didn't, because it was 1817. My mistake. Yes, James Madison would not live in the White House again. It would be James Monroe who would ultimately live in the White House, because it wasn't finished until 1817 when James Monroe would take the presidency. All right, next major event of the Madison presidency was the occupation of West Florida. So Madison wanted this area of West Florida right here. So Florida is actually a long, skinny state, so it sticks out this peninsula right here, but then it also runs along the edge here. And this West Florida area was controlled by different Native American groups, but Madison believed that the Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson had negotiated with Napoleon gave us control of West Florida, and so he thought it was the United States property. Ultimately, Madison wouldn't do anything about it. A group of rebels, so people that just got together, grabbed some guns, and ran out into the woods, would take it over and kick all of the Native Americans out of this territory. And then ultimately, after they had control of it, Congress decided, well, we should make this official, and so they annexed it. Annex means to just basically to decide that something should be a part of the United States, and so you make a public announcement, and then it becomes part of it. The last major event of his presidency was National Bank. Originally, a national bank was created. It was Alexander Hamilton's plan under the Washington presidency. And it was created so the government could give out business loans to people to spur on the economy. They could loan money to people so they could start businesses, and loan money so the United States could buy things that they needed. And the charter for it ran out during Madison's presidency. A charter is basically you get a certain number of years to operate this bank, and then once the charter's done, you have to close the bank. And so Madison was on the fence about it. We didn't know if he wanted to create another national bank, because there was lots of people who complained about it and thought that the people who got loans were, it wasn't fair who was getting loans and who wasn't. But Madison ultimately decided to create a second national bank to help with the economy. So Madison served 2 terms from 1808 to 1816. And then Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, ultimately became president in 1816 to follow him. Madison continued to stay involved in lots of things after his presidency. He became the president or rector of the University of Virginia afterwards, and the University of Virginia is Thomas Jefferson's university, so him and Thomas Jefferson were very close throughout their lives. Madison ultimately died in 1836 at the age of 85. So hopefully you have a better understanding of the famous war that you probably didn't know anything about, the War of 1812, and have a sense of what Madison was able to accomplish in his presidency, which was to basically move the British out of the way so that the West could expand, and then occupy pieces of land throughout the United States to keep expanding the size of the United States.